Uro, Urawaza, which contains all these little devices that they have in Japan for making your life much more convenient. So his vision is to broaden the presentation of the Japanese pop miasma, so that it's not just anime and manga, but it's clothing, fashion, hairstyles, glasses that Sarah Palin wore, apparently were made in Japan. All of these things that they have on one floor a huge screening room, surround sound screening room that shows only Japanese anime and movies. So he's trying to do just what you're talking about. So I think, well, my publisher's already asked me to write another book, a sequel book, but I'm not ready yet to do that. So, good question. Yeah.
You mentioned early on about how Disney influenced early on.
Katsucon.
Right. What I'm wondering is what it's basically like today. Basically, if it's been internalized that today's artists are looking at, people like Tezuka and his successors, or are they looking outward to anybody else for inspiration?
Japanese artists, or?
Yeah, who are Japanese artists looking for inspiration?
I think today it's arguable that Japanese artists now are looking at other Japanese artists. And if you go visit Pixar in San Francisco, they treat Miyazaki like God. What's that? Amen. Amen, yes, indeed. Yeah.
Yes.
Let me go over here first. Yeah.
In your book, you stated that some experts claim that anime and manga, that Japan was the first country to be postmodernist before the term was even coined. And so my question is, do you disagree with this, whereas manga or anime may have actually given birth to postmodernism or cyberpunk?
Yeah, it's a wild question. Whether Japan, first of all, was postmodern before the term even came about, and then whether Japanese anime and manga sort of preceded or created or generated cyberpunk. It's such a, it's a really good question, but it's such an academic question in a way, because what actually is postmodernism? And I feel like a fool saying that, because I went to university and studied Pynchon and Lacan and all these theorists, and I guess once upon a time I knew what it was, but now it seems like when you talk about Japanese culture, going back, 12 centuries, it has always been a place, I think partly because of its status as an island nation, that never really became imperial the way the Great Britain did. That was always choosing what it liked from influences and chucking the rest. So for example, probably some of you know tempura, which we think of as classic Japanese food. It came from the Portuguese. Right? The Japanese just liked this way of preparing vegetables and shrimp and so on, but they thought that the Portuguese version was too greasy. So they kind of refined it to make it this very, very light batter that the Japanese liked. And they didn't take the potatoes from the Portuguese. Right? They don't like that heavy potato stuff, right? So they've always kind of, same with China and other influences, they've picked and chosen what they liked and chuck the rest. So the result can look postmodern, because it's like, wow, this is partly Portuguese and that thing's from Spain, and then the Japanese brought all these things from China, but not that part, and then they stick it all together, right? And it becomes a new kind of Japanese culture. But since you could trace it so far back, it seems like the term postmodern just is pointless, because they weren't thinking of it saying, this is really, we're gonna beat those Westerners in the game, This is postmodern before modernism, It wasn't self-conscious that way. So, but it does make for a fascinating culture, I think.
Would you say now that especially looking at the influences between Japan and the U.S., that it's more turning into a more form of hybridization versus the postmodern or globalization, where you're looking at a hegemonic view, and instead being more hybridized, because you can see influences in both places. The media here in the U.S., especially with Animatrix and all of that coming in.
Afro Samurai and stuff like
Samurai.
that. Yeah. So that's the question, in case you didn't hear it, is it becoming more a hybridization or a hybridized art form? And I would just answer that very quickly by saying two things are happening, and this is very typical, again, of Japan. One, there is definitely a hybridization taking place. And if you look at a particularly adventurous anime studio, Gonzo, or GDH, the co-producers of Afro Samurai, they now have two divisions. One is called GDH, or Gonzo Digimation Holdings International, which produces Afro Samurai, and they're hoping some other projects. And the other is still just called Gonzo. And Gonzo just keeps churning out anime for their Japanese fans. And they don't pay any attention to Gonzo Digimation Holdings or Gonzo International. And the reason I say that is because a lot of folks who visit Japan for longer than a week, if you're just there for a week, you might think, oh, look at all the Starbucks, it's the same as New York. But once you spend a little more time there, and you realize the deeper cultural complexities that still govern daily life in Japan, it's not like New York at all. And it's not even like Hong Kong or Singapore, cities that have really come to feel much more westernized. Tokyo and Osaka, when you really spend some time in their big cities, they still feel deeply, essentially, intrinsically Japanese. In fact, you start to internalize a lot of the rules that govern daily life in Japan once you stay for a little while. They always call Japan the shame culture, which is too strong. There's also guilt in Japan. But that's a cliche, right? Which we can throw away right now. However, when you do something really stupid on the subway that you're not supposed to do in Japan, and you know if you did it in New York, nobody would care, or somebody would just say, shut up, or get out of my way. But in Japan, if you get that look, you really feel ashamed. What's that? If you cough without a mask. If you just do, there are certain things that you really internalize very quickly, and you realize this place is still really Japanese. It's still really governed by a powerful sense of cultural etiquette and behavior. And so, to go back to your question, I think what's happening is that, as with many things Japanese, yes, this hybridization can occur. Like, oh, go ahead, have a California roll, right? Mm-hmm. But we're not going to have it here, folks, because we don't like that thing, right? You can do that, and you can have fun at your Japanese restaurant in Los Angeles or Palo Alto, but when we get back to Japan, we do it this way. So I think that's happening with anime as well, I think.
I was actually lucky enough to go there. I worked there a few times. And,
Great.
One thing that did kind of surprise me was that there was certain characters that did seem to resonate with the Japanese culture, like, say, Stitch of Lilo and Stitch.
Yes.
And then Nightmare Before Christmas.
Nightmare Before Christmas, yeah.
Really, really big. It seemed to be just everywhere. So it was kind of neat that, they were actually looking at some newer stuff too, not just kind of some of the older.
That's right, and there's, I'm going to forget the name, somebody can help me here. There's an American comic that has received the anime treatment in Japan. Witchblade, which is an amazing comic, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Witchblade was, I think it's the first one. Most animation in Japan, not all, but most is based on a manga series, like a Japanese comic series. And Witchblade is an American manga series or comic series that has been turned into an anime, given the Japanese treatment. So it's absolutely true. I mean, there's certain things that just resonate very, very well with the Japanese. For a while ago, it was Meg Ryan. Every tea ad had Meg Ryan. Every ad for skincare, and she was kind of considered kawaii, really cute. And then she just dropped off the radar. I don't know what happened to Meg Ryan. So Jessica Simpson's on Japanese TV. Speaking awful Japanese, trying to sell skincare products and stuff. It's somebody, there's an American cute that Japanese people really like too, and it hits in waves. But Witchblade, I wouldn't describe as kawaii. They just thought it was cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Yeah.
Do you think you mentioned Witchblade? Do you think there would be more of an effort for Japanese producers to try and take something American and almost regurgitate it in the hopes of selling it back to the American market? I mean, there's already an example of American comic companies trying to take existing characters and magnifying them, for lack of a better term yet, Star Wars manga, Spider-Man,